Or it could be a really bad thing if not. If you're the brother of somebody who was a real, or a sister of somebody who's a real achiever, and you're not, then that isn't a good thing, is it? Because you're always being compared to that person. Well, what we're going to read this morning, spoken of Jesus and of another person as well, they are addressed as the son of such and such. They are identified by that person. And for the examples that we're going to give, that is a good thing. But where we are in the story is a really special time, because as we go on into chapter 19, Jesus is going to present himself at Jerusalem. You know the story. He'll ride in on a donkey, and he'll present himself as king to the nation if they would accept him. We call it Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry. But we're just days before that. The stories that we're going to read are some of the last times that Jesus has a personal meeting with somebody before Passion Week. So they're really quite significant. And in Luke 18, verse 31, we read this, that Jesus, taking the 12, said to them, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished." We're going to find out that Jesus is down in a valley. He is near Jericho. And those of you that have been to Israel know that valley, as the Jordan comes down to the Dead Sea, gets lower and lower and lower. And Jericho is about 600 feet below sea level. So when Jesus says we are going up to Jerusalem, well, he's right. He's got to go 3,000 feet above sea level to get there. But more than that, he's going up to that place of offering himself. If we could just have that a little bit quieter still, Chris, thanks. And Jesus feels a need to say again to the 12 what he's going to do. We're going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. Who knows where the title Son of Man comes from in the Bible? Yes, yep, Daniel 7. So turn back to Daniel 7, if you would, in your Bible. Daniel chapter 7. And in the book of Daniel, there are all kinds of prophecies made, aren't there, about what's going to happen in the world. Sometimes there'll be a statue with different colored parts to its body. Or in Daniel 7, there are different beasts that speak of empires to come in the world. So there's a symbol for Babylon, there's a symbol for Persia, and for Greece and for Rome. And in chapter 7, those beasts are destroyed by one who's called the Ancient of Days, and that's God. And in Daniel 7, verse 13, Daniel says this, "I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and the kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." Jesus used this title of himself, the one who God, in Daniel 7, would give the kingdom to, the one whose kingdom won't be destroyed, the one who every people and country and language would worship. And Jesus, the son of a carpenter, gave this title to himself. You see what he's saying? I am the king. And Son of Man, when I thought about, I'm the son of Alan, or if you're the sister of such and such, well, Jesus identifies himself with who? Man, mankind. The one who would be the king of everything became a man. And he didn't just identify himself with men, did he? With mankind, with humans, but he became one of us. And so when Jesus says the Son of Man is going up, he's saying, I, the king, the one who will receive all authority, the one who has become human, am going up to Jerusalem. And everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. Now, we must remember that God, who became a man, he took on human characteristics, and he also let go of some divine privileges. We read about it in Philippians 2. And one of those is Jesus limited himself to human knowledge, to human growth. He didn't automatically become an expert carpenter, did he? He had to learn how to use a chisel and whatever. And so Jesus would study the scriptures. And as he studied them, can you imagine when he'd meditate on some of those passages? Imagine him, as a 20-something-year-old. And he's getting to grips now with the carpentry. But he's really dwelling on the scriptures. He said, everything written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. I want us to turn to Psalm 41, please. Psalm 41. Imagine as Jesus read Psalm 41. Perhaps in the daily readings in the synagogue, it came up one Sabbath, or maybe in private. And as he read Psalm 41, the experience of David, he'd read verse 9, which says, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. Turn back to Psalm 22, please. Psalm 22 and verse 6. Another one of the Psalms of David. And in verse 6, Jesus would have read, I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. And imagine that same Jesus reading from the scroll of Isaiah, which we know that he did. Reading from the chapter that we just read, Isaiah 53. And verse 3, where it says that the servant was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, one from whom men hide their faces, despised and not esteemed. Jesus would have meditated on these passages of the Bible and knew that they spoke of himself. So Jesus takes aside the 12 and says that everything spoken about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. He'll be delivered over to the Gentiles, betrayed, like we read. He'll be mocked and shamefully treated, like we read. Psalm 50 and verse 6, I'll read to you. Jesus would have read this passage too. I give my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting. So when Jesus explained to the 12 that he would be delivered to the Gentiles, mocked, shamefully treated, and spat upon, it was because he knew this from the scriptures. And after flogging him, they will kill him. That same Psalm 22 says of that person that they pierce my hands and my feet. As Yeshua, the carpenter, would sit and read or meditate on the scrolls, he'd read that too. And he'd also read from the Psalms, Psalm 16. And verse 10, which in spite of the sorrows that the psalmist had, he said that you will not abandon my soul to Sheol or let your Holy One see corruption. And so Jesus could say that they will kill the Son of Man, but on the third day he will rise. All of the previous things happened to him. He was flogged, he was mocked, he was spat upon. But where it says on the third day he will rise, he took the power for himself. Things weren't being done to him. He rose himself. Jesus said, nobody takes my life from me, but I lay it down and I have the authority to take it up again. And so I want us to think that the Son of Man who was prophesied accomplished these things. You know it already, it wasn't an accident, but he said that these things will be accomplished. I don't accomplish knocking a mug of tea on the floor, do I? It happens, it's an accident. But I accomplish a task or a project. I've worked and deliberately gone along with that. Jesus accomplished these things. It was deliberate. The Son of Man who was prophesied came to give his life for us and to rise. But the 12 understood none of these things. The saying was hidden from them, and they did not grasp what was said. And you might explain these things to people. You might think about these things for yourself, and you just don't grasp it. For me, I feel there's so much more than what I already know about Jesus. Do you ever feel like that? That sometimes you're just on the tip of the iceberg. You know there's more of him to know. And you want to pursue that knowledge. Like it says in Hosea 6, come, let us return, let us pursue him. But I feel that, I can't grasp what I said. Well, we can ask that the Lord does open our eyes. Like he does with the next person in Luke chapter 18. In Luke 18, verse 35, we read that as Jesus drew near to Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. Now, I want you to walk with us to Jericho. You know the story from the Old Testament about Jericho? Some people say it was the first city that had walls. Yeah, Joshua. And what did they have to do? Yeah. And shout and blow the trumpets, and the walls came tumbling down. Yeah, some archaeologists believe that was the first walled city, which is amazing, isn't it? Because that's the one that God would topple. But in Jesus' day, you're down in the valley. Say you're walking south, up to your right are the hills that slope up to your right, are the hills that slope up to Jerusalem. To your left are looking out over the hills towards the east. And you're in a very lush valley. Jericho is famous for palm trees. They exported balm and dates, and so there was a lot of trade that went through there. It was a busy place. It was one of the main roads from Galilee to Jerusalem. So people were passing through all the time. It was a city of the Levites, so where the priest and the Levites were stationed, ready to serve at the temple. Because it's a place where lots of people pass through, there's crime there. Because it's a place where there's a lot of trade, there's a lot of taxes to be made there. But also, the old city had sort of fallen into disrepair, and there was a new city of Jericho that was built by Herod. That's where he spent the winter in his palaces. And knowing that helps us. Because when you read Luke, it says, as Jesus drew near to Jericho, there was a blind man sitting. Whereas if you read Matthew, it will say, as Jesus was leaving Jericho, there were two blind men. Now, some people will say the Bible contradicts there. We don't believe it's so. Jesus had walked through old Jericho, so he left Jericho, and there were two blind men on his way into New Jericho, where most of the people were. Of those two blind men, the one was more vocal. The one was more notable. His name's Bartimaeus, although he's not named here. And so that's why Luke says that as Jesus drew near to Jericho, there was a blind man. It's not a contradiction. Anyway, this blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. And hearing a crowd going by, he inquired what this meant. And they told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. His days would be very much the same. He'd wake up, probably quite early. You can only tell by the sounds and perhaps the temperature whether it was day or night. He'd pull on his cloak, which he always kept by him because if it was any further away than his reach, he might lose it. He pulled on that same old cloak and grabbed his stick and he shuffled that same path outside the city gate. Maybe somebody gave him a bit of bread on the way. And then he sat down in that same spot that he was familiar with his friends, and they got prepared to beg. They heard some of the ladies chatting as they carried water from the well. They'd hear the gates open up. They'd start to hear the traders coming in on their camels, but they wouldn't see a thing. It was darkness. But in that darkness, he'd heard a lot. And he'd heard about this man, Jesus of Nazareth, as had everybody in the country. And so when a crowd comes by and he finds out this is Jesus of Nazareth coming by, he's putting things together in his mind now. What he goes on to do is cry out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And those who were in front, because people didn't really care, he couldn't see anyway, I'll stand in front of him. Those who were in front rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he would cry out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me, a desperate cry. Why did he shout out? Why did he shout to Jesus as the Son of David? Well, in the Old Testament, God made lots of promises, didn't he? Covenants. And one of these was a covenant with David, Israel's greatest king. You read it most clearly in 2 Samuel 7. And God promised when David wanted to build God a house, a temple, well, God said, no, you can't build me a house, but I will build you a house. In other words, a family, a dynasty. And you'll have a throne and want to sit on that throne perpetually forever. A son of yours will reign forever. And the Son of David became known, or a title used, of the Messiah. The Jews had gone through lots of oppression. At this point, they were ruled by Rome, weren't they? And so they were just eager for the Messiah to come, and they spoke a lot of the Son of David. This blind man, he'd been thinking about that. He'd heard of others who'd been healed. He'd heard that Jesus of Nazareth was using the title Son of Man about himself. And he knew that this might be his only chance to get his attention. And so it didn't matter if people shouted at him saying, shut up, don't be stupid. Be quiet. He shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. What had Jesus said before this? I'm going up to Jerusalem. He knew what was coming, and he was willing to go. But I want you to read what Jesus did in verse 40. The first three words were, "And Jesus stopped." People had threatened Jesus about what might come when he came to Jerusalem. Herod's going to do you in. The priests hate you. That didn't deter Jesus, did it? He carried on to Jerusalem. His well-meaning friends, like Simon Peter, said, "Far be it from you, Lord, that you would suffer." But did that deter Jesus? No. He carried on. Jesus is days away from Jerusalem when he will offer himself as the Lamb of God at Passover. But when one blind man shouts, "Son of David, have mercy on me," Jesus stopped. And I think that is a window into the heart of God, isn't it? "17 miles from Jerusalem, where he'd be brutally killed, he was stopped by the humble cry of a needy man." And if you are hurting or feel like, I've got no hope, if you feel helpless, then your plea as well to Jesus will meet his ears, will cause him to stop. Jesus stopped and commanded him to be brought to him. So as he was helped up, being a blind man, he couldn't make his own way. When he came near, he asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said, "Lord, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Recover your sight. Your faith has made you well." And immediately, he recovered his sight. And what was the first thing that he saw? Jesus. Not the palm trees of beautiful Jericho. Not his mate who'd been begging with for the past few years, but Jesus. He opened his eyes and he saw Jesus. And when your journey on earth is done, Christian, and your eyes are fully open to see him as he is, he's the first one you'll see. Immediately he recovered his sight and he followed him, glorifying God. And all the people, when they saw it, gave praise to God. Jesus is seen as the Son of David, the one who will receive David's kingly throne. And he was stopped by somebody's plea saying, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And finally, we read from Luke 19:1 to verse 10. He entered Jericho and was passing through. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was the kingpin of the Jericho tax cartel. He was not a nice guy. Slimy, small, as we find out, filthy rich through extortion of people. This was Zacchaeus. Of all the people that deserved the attention of Jesus, he was last place. He was hated. He was Jewish. And do you know what his name means? Pure. He was as far from the meaning of his name as possibly can be. He wasn't pure. He'd sold himself out to Rome. He wasn't just a tax collector who gathered them, but he was a chief tax collector. He was farming out the taxes. And he was rich. Yet, he was seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not because he was small in stature. Imagine the wall of crowds. And here's little Zacchaeus down here. Let me through. Oh, sorry, Zacchaeus, I didn't see you there. Was that your toe? I do apologize, Zacchaeus. Oh, I'm so sorry. Not. They wouldn't let him through, and he couldn't see. So he ran on ahead, and he climbed up into a sycamore tree. These are planted in places of concourse or marketplaces to provide shade. They're not dissimilar to an English oak. Lovely big branches. You can climb them easily. And they have figs. So he climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him because he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up. Zacchaeus was probably trying to hide in the branches. Can you imagine how he'd feel when the entourage stopped? Jesus looked up and everybody looked up at him. Was Jesus finally going to put him in his place? His heart was pounding. What's he going to say? But he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, which is amazing of itself, isn't it? How did he know his name? How would he feel when Jesus spoke his name? Hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. If that was me, I'd freeze. But Zacchaeus hurried and he came down and he received him joyfully. And when they saw it, the crowd, because perhaps they were thinking, oh, maybe Jesus will stay at my place tonight and I can wow him with the best falafel in Jericho and the loveliest dates. And we can sit out under a palm tree. So when Jesus went to Zacchaeus' house, they grumbled. He's gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. But in the house, perhaps when they'd had some food, maybe they chatted, Zacchaeus stood. And it didn't really make much of a difference whether he stood or he sat. But he stood and he said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, acknowledging you're the boss. The half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. The Old Testament didn't require that. You had to give a fifth back, or if you'd stolen a sheep, you had to give 4 sheep back. So he was going above and beyond, really, what was required. If I have defrauded anyone of anything, well, surely he had, because that's how he made his money. I restore it fourfold. What the rich young ruler refused to do, Zacchaeus did willingly, without being asked. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Salvation came that day. Not because Zacchaeus gave his stuff away, but Zacchaeus gave his stuff away because salvation had come to the house. He proved himself to be a son of Abraham. What does that mean? Well, a descendant of Abraham. And all the Jews prided themselves on being a descendant of Abraham, as is still the case today. But it meant more than that. If you turn to Romans chapter 4 and verse 11, we read about it. Romans 4, verse 11, talks about Abraham, that he received the sign of circumcision, Romans 4:11, as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that the righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. Circumcision was that sign of being Jewish. But what really made you a son or a daughter of God was the faith that Abraham had. That's how he was accounted righteous. And this is what Zacchaeus showed. Faith. He said, Lord. And he knew he got nothing to give, or nothing pure and acceptable to give, because all he had was stolen. All I can give is myself, and I give myself to you in faith. And so Jesus says, salvation has come to this house. And you know, when you come in faith to Christ, you are changed, aren't you? And I hope that that change has made its way to your possessions as well, like Zacchaeus. That theme has come up several times for us in the past few months, hasn't it, church? I hope that your possessions don't possess you. But that if that's what the Lord calls you to do, there you are, Lord. They're gone, they're yours. I just want to wrap up and talk about being a child of Abraham. That means being part of God's family, his people. And we can learn much about what it means to become a child of Abraham through what we've read this morning. To become a child of Abraham, you've got to call out to Jesus, like blind Bartimaeus did. Son of David, have mercy on me. You've got to know your need. Do you think it's easier for an Olympic swimmer or a toddler to receive the help of a lifeguard? Well, it's easier for a toddler. Put them in a riptide, in a storm. Both of them need saving. But that Olympic swimmer might think, well, I'll be okay, I'm strong enough. He doesn't know his need, and he might say no to the offer of being saved. Well, the blind man knew his need. What do you want me to do for you, Lord? Recover my sight. If we know our desperate need before God of forgiveness of sin, then we can be forgiven. And if you don't know that need, you can pray that your eyes are opened. To be a child of Abraham, we've got to put our trust in the person of Jesus. To be a child of Abraham, don't let others hinder you from coming or get in the way. Or if you are a child of Abraham, then still, don't let peer pressure stop you coming to the Lord. A real friend will not get in the way of you coming to Jesus. Receive him into your life like Zacchaeus did. Zacchaeus didn't just receive doctrine, he received Jesus into his home. And experience joy. He hopped, skipped, and jumped out of that sycamore tree. He couldn't wait, even if the house was dirty. He received him joyfully. Know a transformed life. And I'm sure this is your experience, but you found out, even when you were seeking after Jesus, that he was the one who would come to seek after you in the first place. You thought you were climbing a tree to get a good glimpse of Jesus. You thought you were reading that book or chatting to that friend or going to that church, but it turned out all along he'd come to seek you. Such is our God. Jesus is the Son of Man, the King eternally. He's the Son of David who will sit on his throne, literally. And we can be a son of Abraham, part of God's family. We're going to take some time out to pray, to process what we've heard. During that time, if the Lord's spoken something to your heart, and then share that as well in this time of prayer. But we'll pray about these things. We'll remember those in our church family. We're going to remember Heather's dad. We're going to remember Joe. And we'll take some time without rushing. And after that, we'll sing and bring our time to a close. But let's pray together.